Well, welcome to our webinar, Money Talks, Arranging Finances for Post-Secondary Education. Today, we would like to present two new modules for Stage 2. My name is Dori Tarjan, and my co-host and co-developer is Marijke Geurts. And also a huge thank you to Paul Carter for being our moderator today. Before we begin, I would like to say that New Language Solutions is based in Ottawa, Ontario. We acknowledge that our head office is on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Beyond Ottawa, we have staff working in locations across Canada. New Language Solutions is grateful to have the opportunity to work as a guest in communities and territories across the country. And we honor the stewardship of the many Indigenous peoples who have resided in these lands since time immemorial. We make our acknowledgement as a sign of respect for all Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, past and present. We accept the true impact of the past and the pain suffered by generations of Indigenous peoples. As an agency that works to support the integration of newcomers into Canadian society and cultures, we resolve to support activities that are inclusive of Indigenous peoples. We will make our best efforts to address a history of injustice to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We encourage our frontline staff and clients to discover whose traditional territories they live on and pause to reflect on the hospitality shown to us as guests in these territories. So I myself live in Mississauga, Ontario, which is part of the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee people and also covered by Treaty 13A.
And I live in the Willistook River Valley in New Brunswick.
All right, let's look at our agenda. Today, we'll be looking at two modules you can find under the post-secondary education theme, even though they are also a perfect fit for financial literacy. So the first module we'll look at is Navigating Student Aid for Post-Secondary Education. It's for CLB 5-6. And the second, Applying for Financial Aid, is for CLB 7-8. We will present some background information and the real-world tasks of these modules, and then we'll take a closer look at the skill-building activities and assessment tasks. We would like to present these modules while focusing on blended delivery and how the online and in-class components build on each other. And as we go through our presentation, we would also like to offer some tips that hopefully will help making the most of these modules and also make your lessons more engaging for learners. If you have any questions, please hold them till the end or post them in the chat so we can discuss them if they are applicable or answer them at the end. So before jumping into the details about these two modules, let's look at some features that are the same across all NLS modules. These are just technical details, but being aware of them, we believe can be helpful while planning your courses. Each module has the same layout in Avenue. So there's a label on top with the learning outcomes and the picture. Below, there's a For the Teachers section that has printable and audio files for in-class use and also the module package. This whole section can remain hidden from learners. The For Learners section has 5 parts. The Getting Started activities introduce learners to the overall topic and the vocabulary. Then follow the 4 skills. They are in an order that we, the developers, believe is the most logical for the real-world tasks in each of these skills. Each skill has 2 or 3 skill building activities, followed by skill using and assessment tasks. The skill using and assessment tasks are differentiated by CLE levels. And it is our recommendation that you include all the skill building activities because they prepare learners to succeed in the assessment task. Let's take a look at the module package. As I mentioned, each module has a module package. This is a printable document that has a description of the module, teaching notes, list of resources, handouts, and more. The package is available as a PDF and also a Word document, making it possible to adapt handouts if necessary. The module package is, as I said, is under the For Teachers label, so it is hidden from learners. Each of our modules are structured to follow the flipped approach, where learners complete skill building activities independently online, which prepare them for the in-class lesson, where they consolidate their knowledge and practice their skills with their peers. We would like to stop here briefly and ask you about your experience with the flipped approach.
Here we go with the first poll.
Thank you.
So
the question is, what is, sorry.
Go ahead.
The question is, what is your experience with the flipped approach? And there are 5 options, from no experience at all. I always use the flipped approach.
I find it helpful, especially if there's it's a blended class, and I have taught CLB 2 and 3 class, and sometimes CLB 3 and 4 combined classes. So I feel that I think it's about researching, partly researching, and also knowing what works, but also asking oneself, okay, does this work for the class? Is it appropriate for the theme or a topic of the class? And can my students use this? Is it effective? Those are the questions that guide me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. All right. So let's take a closer look at the contents of the module package. So it has a detailed module plan with competency statements, language focus, real-world tasks, a list of further resources. These are a combination of online and print materials grouped by skill. There are some printable goal setting and reflection handouts. There is a list of in-class vocabulary building activities that build on the online glossary as well as the online vocabulary activity. There are descriptions of each online activity with teaching notes and in-class lesson plans with handouts. So we wanted to add a tip here. Even though the module package has a brief description of the online skill building activities, it is still a good idea to review the actual task in Avenue and see how it relates to the classroom activity. Some of the H5Ps, for example, have a prepare for class slide where learners are asked to prepare questions or topics and bring them to class. There are descriptions of the online assessment tasks with answer keys and transcripts. Another tip here for navigation. So while in Avenue, the assessment tasks are grouped by skill with the skill building activities, in the package, there's a separate section for them at the end. And finally, there is a printable version of all assessment tasks for in-class use. So It's best to familiarize yourself with the content of the task before deciding how you'll assign them in class or online. And if needed, of course, demonstrate the online task so learners are familiar with the navigation. All right, Marijke, should we take a look at our first module in more detail?
Yeah, let's dive into the modules, Dori. Before you begin either of these two modules with your learners, whether you're using the module for CLB 5.6 or 7.8, they should have some understanding of post-secondary education in Canada, such as the difference between college and university. They should also have an awareness of some financial products, for example, loans and line of credit. And it is also helpful if they understand the purpose of scholarships and grants and the role and purpose of registration forms. When learners have this kind of background knowledge, they will be successful in these modules. So here's a closer look at the module for CLB 5.6, Navigating Student Aid for Post-Secondary Education. Although the abbreviation for this module is NSA, I assure you, we have nothing to do whatsoever with any intelligence agencies. In this module, learners will listen to a slide presentation about the cost of education. Then they will read a guide about financial aid options. They will fill out a form with personal information to register for a presentation. And finally, they're going to talk to friends about the pros and cons of financial products. So you notice that the order of the skills is not listening, speaking, reading, writing, as it is in the CLBs, in the CLB book. But here we go for listening, reading, writing, speaking. And Dori already mentioned that's because when we develop the modules, we think about the most logical order of activities in the real world. In the modules that we create, there's a kind of a narrative that connects the different language tasks. Often, information learners get while practicing one skill will tie in with the next part, and they'll use that information in another activity. So again, please review the entire module before you start using it so that you're familiar with all the different bits and pieces and how things work together. So here's another quick poll. Which of these tasks do you think your learners would find the most challenging, or what do they need the most practice with? And I'm just going to share it with you. Hopefully that's the right one. So those are the 4 real world tasks. Which of them do you think would be most challenging for your learners?
I feel that reading a guide and filling out a form might be difficult for some language learners. You see, maybe depending on their circumstances, their home country, maybe if some of them have never read a financial aid guidebook, or maybe they've never had to fill out a form with personal information. So maybe they don't have a basis on which to follow. So for them, this might be a completely new experience, like how to fill out information. I remember teaching a class once and giving them a practice form to fill out. Some of them didn't know where information went. Some of them thought they just had to fill their name and that was it. So it would, I guess it depends on the student, as well as maybe some of them are familiar with such forms or guides, and maybe others haven't had background knowledge.
That's a really good point. So let's take a look at the activities in the module to see how we prepare them for reading texts like that and filling out those forms. So each module opens with a getting started section. And this is the same across all modules that we develop. where learners get to familiarize themselves with the module vocabulary, and they get a general idea of the tasks that follow. So first they review the module glossary and complete a practice activity with words and expressions related to paying for post-secondary education. And the words in the glossary and skill building activity are taken from the listening and reading tasks in the module. So they're directly related to what learners will be reading and listening to. Besides these online activities, in the module package, you will also find several other suggestions and a reference list of the new words. And then in the introduction forum, learners will start thinking about how you can pay for education or training. And forums like these are really important for learners to create a classroom community, especially if your program is online or mostly online and they don't see each other a lot. So on the forum, they can get to know each other a little bit better. And as their teacher, you should also participate in this conversation to show that you're present online as well as during class times. The package also offers handouts for goal setting at the beginning. And once learners have completed their goals, it's time to really dig in. Right, Dori?
That's right. So the first skill in this module is listening. And this green arrow is supposed to demonstrate how the skill building activities gradually build learners' skills and knowledge, surprise, to succeed in the final task. And the final task under listening in this module is watching a slide presentation about financial aid options for post-secondary education. So here we have 3 skill building activities where learners will first practice understanding and using numbers, then making connection between graphics on slides, like this one, and the narration of the presenter, and then finally follow details of presentations. So we usually try to weave characters or some sort of background story through our modules. And so here, the 3 presentations in the third skill building, the skill using, and the assessment task are parts of one larger presentation. The content in one logically follows the previous so that learners do not only practice the language skills, but they also get a full picture of the cost of living while in school, the cost of different programs, and the financial aid options to pay for the education. So let's just look at one of the skill building activities and how the online part prepares learners for the in-class lesson. The second skill building activity is about the connection between graphics on slides and the content of a presentation. In the online task, which is an H5P, learners look at several images and graphics that could appear on presentation slides and how those graphics represent concepts such as contrast, illustration, or cause and effect. So on the left, you see the screenshot of the slide that focuses on contrast, for instance. Learners will look at some examples and read sentences with different connectors and associate them with graphics that express the same idea. In the classroom activity, learners listen to a brief text read by the instructor, and first they take notes on the keywords and ideas in the first text box, and then they create some graphics themselves that could represent the ideas of the text on these different slides, on the gray slides. So while the online activity is self-correcting, so it is ideal for independent work, during the in-class activity, learners can compare their work and get ideas from each other and have discussions. So let's look at now at the final task which is watching slide presentations in the skill using task about the cost of school, and in the assessment task about financial aid, so student loans and scholarships. First of all, the content in the assessment task is based on information from the National Student Loan Services Center's website. So you can direct learners to that website if they're interested in further details. Both the skill using and the assessment tasks can be completed either online or in person. The online quiz, which is the screenshot in the middle, is partially self-corrected. So some of the open-ended questions need to be manually marked, and then the final score will be calculated after that. Both tasks have different versions for CLB 5 and 6. CLB 6 will watch a slightly longer presentation and also answer a few more questions. And just an important technical detail, the online quizzes are restricted, so learners can only open the CLB 6 quiz if their Avenue profile has CLB 6 checked. And then the screenshot on the right is the paper-based quiz. If you choose to administer this task in class, then learners can watch the presentation together on a smartboard or using a projector, and they can work on the quiz questions independently. So in this module, after listening, comes the second skill, which is reading, with the final task of reading an article with instructions about scholarships and student loans. The intention is, again, to focus on the skills needed to succeed in this final task. So in the skill building activities, learners will first practice identifying the function of gerunds, then inferring the order of steps in written instructions, and then identifying the purpose of written texts. So let's take a look at one of the skill building activities again and how the flipped approach supports learning. In the third skill building activity, learners will practice reading different types of texts and identifying the writer's purpose by looking at the vocabulary, the style, the format, and the tone. In the online activity, an imaginary character reads 4 different texts on a smartphone. They are a text message, an article, an email, and an ad. So on the left, you see the screenshot of the slide where they read the news article. For each of these texts, they have to select the writer's purpose from a multiple choice question. Before jumping into the classroom activity, it's a good idea to ask learners a few reflection questions about this H5P. Did they find it easy or difficult? Are these the types of texts that they usually read on their smartphones? How did they find out the purpose of the text, and so on? Because it is always helpful in a blended course to follow up on homework and to connect the online activity to the in-class portion, because this will help learners to see how their independent work is linked to classroom work, and also that classroom work will be easier if they've completed their homework. And on the right, you can see the handout for the in-class activity, which is similar to the online task. So here they read a flyer about student lines of credit, answer comprehension questions, and finally have a group discussion about the text and also the features of the text that help identify its purpose. Okay, and as we said before, the final task for reading is an article with a checklist or a list of instructions. Similarly to the listening task, the skill using and the assessment tasks can be completed either online or in the classroom. The online quiz, just like in the listening, is mostly self-corrected, except for the few open-ended questions. And both reading tasks have different versions for CLB5 and CLB6. For CLB6, it's a slightly longer text with a few additional questions. A tip that we briefly mentioned before, it's a good idea to demonstrate online activities, especially because with continuous intake, there can always be new students new to Avenue. So for instance, in this reading task, the reading text will open in a separate tab. So to complete the task, learners will have to keep 2 tabs open and switch between them as they work. Or you may choose to administer this task in class. So you could print off the text and let learners complete the quiz online. All right, now let's move on to the productive skills in this module.
Thanks, Dori. So the next skill is productive. It's writing. So it's one thing to understand what number somebody is saying, but it's just as important to be able to complete forms and to write numbers and dates correctly. The writing skill building activities start with the follow-up activity, which is part B of an activity that was started as a listening activity. Learners use the information that they're already familiar with to complete an online form. And we've used a quiz for this form, which is also the activity type for the skill using and the assessment task. By practicing the type of activity, a quiz in this case, when learners get to the assessment task, they're already familiar with the type of task, so they can focus entirely on the language skill. The other skill building is about answering open-ended questions. When you look at the CLBs, it says that for filling out a form at CLB 5, that form should have 20 to 30 items. And for CLB 6, there should be 30 to 40 items. That seems like a lot of questions to just have learners check off boxes. But we've all completed enough surveys to know that many questions come in 2 parts. There's the please explain, or other, or even if yes, why? So this activity gives practice in responding to those types of open-ended questions. Why? Because practice makes perfect. As we already mentioned, for both the skill using and assessment task, we've used a quiz to create an online fillable form. Learners are presented with a task card with information about the person who's completing the form, and they get a fake PR card as well. They have to use this information to fill out the form. The advantage of using a quiz is that some of the questions will be self-correcting. Other questions will still need to be checked manually by the teacher. However, since this is a writing task, learners cannot score points by answering the questions correctly. They've been set to 0, but you can still add comments to a question if you want to give specific feedback. We've added a rubric in the last essay question. That's the only question with points that you grade based on how the learner completed the online form. However, if you prefer, the skill using and assessment task also have a paper copy in the module package, which you can print out and learners can complete the form on paper. We often use a flipped approach in the module, where the first part of a skill building is an online activity. And then that activity prepares learners for the in-class practice when they get to try out the new skills with a partner or a group. The teaching notes for each activity clearly indicate if the online component or the classroom component should come first. Sometimes the online activity also includes instructions for learners to prepare for class. And sometimes an activity begins in class and there's a follow-up online activity, which is all explained in the teaching notes. For example, in the skill building, using expressions to discuss pros and cons, learners get familiar with various expressions. They listen to an example conversation, and then in class, they practice a similar conversation with the partner about the pros and cons of working while you are in school. Keeping the conversation going is an activity about small talk, for which there are already lots of resources available on Avenue. So therefore, we've created only a handout for in-class work, and for the online component, we refer to other units and modules that you can choose from. The skill using and assessment task for speaking are very similar. In both tasks, learners have a conversation with a partner, talking about student lines of credit or talking about the pros and cons of student loans. To guide the learners in their conversation, we've created task cards with information about the topic. So here at the bottom of the screen, you see what those task cards would include. We've created 2 different task cards that give 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages of the topic. Learners are instructed to exchange the information. So it's not a discussion about who's right or wrong, it's a conversation. The speaking task is the culminating task of this module. So by now, learners should be familiar with the topic of student loans, scholarships, etc. And we really want them to be able to focus on their speaking, on their fluency, and social interaction skills, rather than having to think about what should I say next. And that brings us to the CLB 7-8 module about this topic. Dori, could you start us off?
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, so the next module that we wanted to present today is applying for financial aid. And so while in the first module, learners were getting familiar with these types of financial aids, in this module, they will take a closer look at eligibility criteria and the application process for scholarships, grants, bursaries, student loans, etc. So first, let's take a look at the real-world tasks. So we mentioned before that the order of skills is always different. And in this module, learners will first read about different types of financial aid. Then they will write an email to a friend describing an opportunity, such as a scholarship. They will listen to a friend share difficulties with an application process, and finally explain and give suggestions regarding the application process of a bursary or a scholarship. So we would like to ask you again to think about these 4 real-world tasks, and which of these do you think would be would your learners benefit the most? Or which one do you think learners would need the most practice with? So there's reading about different types of financial aid, writing an email to a friend describing an opportunity, listening to a friend share difficulties, or giving suggestions about an application process.
I think that listening to a friend as well as reading about a financial product is helpful. Now, I do feel that having a text for the students to read is good. Now, since this is a this workshop is for a higher level CLB, like you said, level 6, 7, 8, they would have a solid grasp of English as well as background knowledge. I've only taught like the slightly lower levels, CLB2, CLB3, CLB4s, and I realized that the bigger the text or the more words the text, there's always a risk of some students struggling with grasping the concept. So I think that by doing a real world task of discussing the application process, like what kinds of scholarships are available, or how does one apply, or would the student be eligible or not? In fact, I have a former student turned friend who she's from Korea. Her son goes to school. They're in America, and she was concerned about types of scholarships and bursaries that he may or may not be eligible for. And I just told her, as long as he studies hard and his grades are good, and if he applies early, he has a good chance of getting a scholarship. And that because he's living in the States and because he's from Korea, he may be eligible for some international bursaries as well. So there's that. So when I
That's
think
great.
about that
Thank you.
example, I thought, oh, that is a real world task example.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much for your answers. Now let's take a look at the first skill. Marijke, you're muted still.
I'll cut that out of the video. So the first skill is reading, which follows after the getting started section, again, where learners practice vocabulary and they begin exploring the topic. The two skill building activities prepare learners for different aspects of the skill using and the assessment tasks, such as understanding the purpose and the main idea of a text. And if your learners need more practice with this, then you could also assign the skill building from the 5-6 module, identifying purpose in written texts, because the modules are about the same topic, so they work with each other. Here's a closer look at the skill building using text structure to scan for details. The online component here is not an H5P activity, but a lesson. And in a lesson, learners can choose their own path through the activity, as long as they do all of the components. And they finish with a short quiz. So this type of activity gives learners ownership of their learning. Once again, when they're in class, they apply what they've practiced and they read a text that follows a sequence structure. This activity then connects with the writing skill building, describing how to open a bank account, where learners use the information from the text to write an email to a friend explaining how to set up a bank account. For the skill using reading, we offer the text comparing scholarships, bursaries, and grants. And this article gives information about these 3 types of financial assistance for students in post-secondary education. At CLB 7, the text is about 2 pages, and at CLB 8, there's 1 additional page. However, for the skill using, there's 1 combined handout with questions for both the CLB levels. Some questions are marked CLB 8, so please remember to point this out to your learners. Luckily, online, there are 2 separate quizzes. The text for the assessment task covers student loans and lines of credit, and there are separate texts and questions. If you are able to do both the skill using and the assessment tasks with your learners, then they will get a lot of useful information about options for to finance post-secondary education. And these reading texts really form the foundation of this module as the other skills build on what is learned here. How do learners use that information in writing, Dori?
I'm glad you asked. In writing, which is the next skill in the module, they will use the information that they got from the reading text, and they will write an email to a friend about a bursary in the skill using task and the scholarship in the assessment tasks. So there are many areas that learners may need to work on to succeed in the assessment task. We chose to focus on these three: introducing the purpose of a message, connecting paragraphs of an email, and describing a process in detail. In the module package, however, you will find a list of resources that can support learners in other areas. So, for example, composing an email or writing a coherent paragraph, and so on. So again, let's take a closer look at one of these skill building activities. So the second skill building is where learners practice forming connections between paragraphs of an email. In the online task, they will arrange sections of an email into a logical sequence, answer comprehension questions, and then compose the final paragraph of another email, which they bring to class to share and discuss and compare with their peers. So this is another example of the connection between the online and the in-class activities. And this is also a great opportunity to see learners work and get an idea about what it is that they need to work on more. And then the in-class task is yet another example of an email between friends, where learners have to answer comprehension questions and also questions about how the paragraphs connect to each other. They have to look for words and expressions that they can use to create connection between their paragraphs. And so the final task in this skill is to write an email to a friend about a bursary in the skill using and a scholarship in the assessment task. They write their emails based on task cards. On the slide, you can see the task card of the skill using task. So they have the name, the amount, the eligibility criteria, and the application requirements of a bursary. The task cards appear in the online task, and they can also be printed for in-class use. And I wanted to point out the difference in format between the skill using and assessment task. So the skill using is a Modal quiz, making it possible for learners to fill out a self-assessment form and submit it along with their email. And the assessment task is a Modal assignment. So in the assignment, they can read the criteria first, but there is no self-assessment form. All right, shall we take a look at the listening tasks now?
Maybe we should have a look and a listen. So
Mhm.
Canadians have this image of being polite, and even when we're not happy, we can be quite euphemistic about it. For a second language learner, the true meaning of what we're saying can be difficult to grasp. So it's no wonder that complaints and disapproval don't show up until CLB 7. But I mean, really, come on, how hard can it be? In this module, we took the opportunity to practice listening to a friend who is complaining. We stayed away from swear words, but there is the occasional, oh my God, and similar expressions, because sometimes people are irritated and they are not polite about it. For example, on the slide here, you see the audio for this slide is, aren't you ready yet? Come on, let's go. The meaning depends on the intonation. And you can see the question here. The meaning is, we're late and I'm impatient, or I'm excited and I want to go now. In the skill building activity, complaining and congratulating, the second half is aimed at the CLB 8 competency of offering congratulations. Learners at CLB 7 can also complete this part, but it's not part of their final assessment. Something else that we did again in this module is to have certain characters come back in different activities. For example, the friends Amelia and Amal, who are looking for an apartment close to their college. Learners will meet them in a writing skill building, connecting paragraphs, and then again, in the skill building for listening, understanding implied meanings in social exchanges. The activities don't depend on each other, but the storyline does continue, and learners will get to know some characters a little bit better. In the skill using, learners listen to a conversation between three friends. Do you know those people who always find something to complain about? And those who are always full of good advice? Well, we know them too. And I clicked too fast. So we know these people too. The audio that learners listen to in the skill using has some ambient cafeteria sounds, and while the three speakers talk about the challenges of applying for a student loan. Luckily, there's also cause for congratulations, but only CLB 8 learners answer questions about that part of the conversation. In the assessment task, three other friends are discussing applications for scholarships, which is also not the most straightforward process. The skill using and the assessment task are set up in a similar way. They are in a Modal quiz. So the majority of the questions is auto-corrected, which is great for instructors. However, the applied questions do require manual scoring. And then there's a technical difference between the two tasks. The skill using allows 2 attempts, but for the assessment task, learners can only submit their answers once. And we urge you not to change these settings. If you take out questions from the quiz, if you give learners more time or additional attempts, then these tasks simply don't reflect what is expected of learners at CLB 7 or CLB 8. Okay, end of rant. One important point, if you're using the paper version of the listening assessment task, you will find the answer key in the module package in the section Preparation for the Assessment Tasks at the end of the module package. The full package, transcripts, and the audio files can also be found in the For Teachers section of the online course. Dori, what advice do you have for offering the speaking tasks?
Advice. By the final task, I believe learners will have a bunch to offer to each other, because in the final skill, speaking, learners have to tell a friend about a scholarship and give advice and instructions on how to apply. In the skill building activities, we decided to focus on modal verbs and the range of functions they express, using conjunctive adverbs to connect ideas, and how to give clear and detailed instructions. So out of these 3, let's take a look at the first, skill building, in a little bit more detail. So again, we'll look at the online and the in-class component. In the online part, learners work independently on an H5P. They will listen to conversations and read about the slight differences in meaning between different modal verbs and look at example sentences. In the screenshot, you can see an arrow that indicates how strong the sense of necessity or obligation is in the different modal verbs. So the H5P has infinite retry options. So even if learners have a difficult time identifying the subtle differences, they can redo the exercises as many times as they want. And then after all that practice, during the in-person session, learners will work in pairs and have conversations about different topics. So in the screenshot on the right, you can see 2 information cards with topics and ideas for a conversation. Learners are asked to give each other's advice and suggestions while using the modal verbs from the online activity. And another technical tip, if you will, if you look at the submitted attempts for an H5P or see how many times learners completed the activity, or if you check their score, you can get an idea of how much more review and practice they need in class before you can assign the skill using or the assessment task. And so speaking of the assessment task, the final task in this skill is to give instructions and explanations to a friend about how to apply for a scholarship and a bursary. And in the screenshot, you can see the online activities. But why are there 6 activities for 2 tasks? Well, as usual, there are separate tasks for CLB 7 and 8, but also we wanted to give different options for assessing the speaking tasks. So for the skill using, you can choose between a quiz or the big blue button. If you choose the quiz, then learners will record themselves and submit the recording along with the self-assessment form. However, if you wish to assess this task in pairs, which makes the task a little bit more lifelike, you can choose breakout rooms in the big blue button. And the idea is the same for the assessment task, except since there is no self-assessment part, we used assignment simply because it's easier to provide feedback with a rubric. And of course, there's the option for the more interactive version in the big blue button. And of course, there's also the in-class option, which is not in the screenshot, but you can print the task card and the feedback form for the in-class assessment. And on the right, you can see an example of a task card. So there are 2 cards for each task. And so each learner gives suggestions about a different type of scholarship or bursary. And so this concludes the module applying for financial aid, but we do have a few more things to share. Is that right?
Yeah. Before we wrap up our webinar, we wanted to briefly take a look at how to find our modules. When you select the Preparing for Post-Secondary Education theme in the Avenue course builder, you will find these 2 new modules along with other modules under the same theme. So there are 2 modules about researching and selecting a school program. For CLB 5-6, there's Communicating Choices for College. And for CLB 7-8, there's Deciding on a College Program. And there's also 2 modules about academic and language skills that are used, that you need to go to college or university. For CLB 5-6, there's Developing Academic and Research Skills. And at CLB 7-8, there's Working in Academic Groups. So we hope that you can find those on Avenue. Here's one last thing that we'd like to share with you. NLS has recently partnered with iScience on a project into best practices for teaching asynchronous or online or blended class. And we've shared some tips, best practices with you throughout this presentation. If you're interested in learning more about the best practices and the research that was done, you can take a free PD course that iScience and NLS have developed together. The course has 6 topics, and each topic only takes about 2 hours to complete. So you can do one topic every month. And there's additional resources and sample units for teaching a blended link program. If you are interested, or if you want more information about this PD opportunity, you can send an email to Anita Premkumar at ISAMS, and her email address is on the screen. You can also reach out to me, and I will connect you with Anita.
That sounds great.
Yeah, absolutely. One request, if you've reviewed one of our modules, or even if you've only used a few of the activities, we really appreciate your feedback. So I invite you to complete our feedback. If there's no further questions, Paul, do you have anything else to add?
Just great work. This looks fantastic. All the real world information and the real world skills. I could really see students and their families making full use and taking advantage of these units to be able to actually do things in the real world. This is fantastic.
Yeah, that was one of our
Okay.
goals, to provide information that was true.
Yes.
Some of it
Exactly.
is made up. We had to create some very enticing scholarships and bursary opportunities that are not real.
Yeah. But there are real ones out there. So if
Yeah.
students have the skills to be able to,
Yes.
well, first know that they exist. That's the first step. And then the second step, to be able to find ones that may be applicable to you or your family. And
Yeah.
there are so many things available. It's really incredible. So we give students the skills to be able to find and take advantage of them. This is a great unit, both of them.
Yeah, that's the idea. And we did try in the teaching notes and in the module package, in that page with additional resources, we try to include links to relevant websites, so teachers can do a little bit more digging and share that information with our learners, for sure.
Right.
Cool.
Well, thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.